Hello everyone. In this video I would like to give some backgrounds to the 17th century and set the stage sort of give the intellectual background, set the stage contextually for the literature we're going to be looking at over the course of this summer. In a way, you can think about this as something of a loose voiceover for the PowerPoint presentation that I posted yesterday. And if you followed that presentation, you'll know that we more or less began at the beginning with the beginnings of Western civilization in ancient Greece. And if you think about the ancient Greeks, what animated them, what motivated them, it's useful exercise to think about what the ancient Greeks invented that we still use today. And when we do that, I tend to think in terms of about four main inventions. We can speak of democracy in this regard. We can speak, in addition, of the development of the systematic study of medicine. Not that other societies did not have, let's say, a cure for the toothache, but I'm talking about a systematic study of medicine, almost along philosophical lines. What is health and what is illness, and how does one progress from illness to health, and that kind of thing. I'm thinking as well about something that we enjoy every 4 years, whether or not, I suppose not this year. It's been put off because of the virus, but the Olympic Games. And then I think about, perhaps first and foremost, about democracy. That is, all people ruling themselves, not ruled by one person who decides for an entire community, but essentially a community deciding important matters for itself. And if you look at those four inventions that the ancient Greeks provide that we still use today, if you think about what they have in common, that is, what these inventions tell us about the ancient Greek view of the world, what they all have in common, it seems to me, is that they stress the fact that human beings, roughly speaking, are equal. This is certainly true of the Olympic Games. Next time you're in a large group of people, ask yourself how many of these people would be allowed to try out for the U.S. Olympic team, and the answer is anybody. It's not to say that all would qualify for the team, but how many people are allowed to set it as a goal to try out? Anyone can. I can, even at my advanced age and at my advanced weight and so on. I could try out for the U.S. cross-country Olympic team if I wanted to and set it as a goal. It's not to say that I would make it, but that I would be allowed to try out if I wanted to. The same thing is true of democracy, obviously. The view, again, not that there is a king, a single person who decides the fate of large groups of people under his large groups of subjects, but that you have individuals that comprise a society making decisions for that society as a whole. The same thing is true of medical writing in this sense, that if we were all radically different, the study of medicine would be impossible. That the study of medicine, let's take a division of medicine, cardiology. Cardiology is possible only if all of us have four-chambered hearts in the center of our chests. Only if our anatomy is roughly the same can that anatomy be studied with general kind of benefit. So once again, even something as physical as the study of medicine, predicated on the idea that human beings are, roughly speaking, equal. And then finally, philosophy. And I want to be careful here about what I mean by philosophy. By philosophy, I mean not that someone sits around and wonders about the nature of the universe and our purpose in life. Every culture has had that. But by philosophy, I mean this, that a person can sit around, think about the meaning of life and our purpose here on earth, and then can discuss those ideas, publish those ideas, if you will, though publication, obviously, in the ancient Greek world was different than what we think of as publication today, but make those ideas public, and someone else will come along and interrogate those ideas, think about those ideas, try them out, and then agree or disagree with those ideas. And that's And that points to equality in this sense, that we don't say among the ancient Greeks, whatever Socrates pronounced, we believe it because he was Socrates. No, Socrates is the teacher of Plato. Plato agrees with much of what Socrates said and disagreed with much because, and here's the point, Plato is essentially Socrates' equal. Plato's mind works as well as Socrates. Maybe Socrates is in error in this point or that point, and maybe Plato has a better idea. Then along comes Aristotle, the student of Plato, and Aristotle agrees with Plato on a number of fundamental points. Again, the point is that all of these philosophers are in conversation with one another, and all of them are, as equals, are arguing the issues at hand, and from this argument, new ideas will emerge. We don't say simply because Plato said it, it must be true, or because Aristotle said it, it must be true. We revere them as thinkers, no doubt, because they spent a great deal of time in high-quality thought and wrote well and persuasively, but we don't say we believe something simply because of who said it. Human beings, roughly speaking, are all equal, and therefore we take the ideas on their merits, and we ourselves sit in judgment on those ideas, just as others will come along and sit in judgment on our ideas. So all of these inventions then show that for the ancient Greeks, roughly speaking, human beings are equal. There follows, as you remember from the PowerPoint presentation, there follow the Roman civilization. And then eventually Rome falls apart because of the barbarian invasions. And what had been the western half of the Roman Empire then was broken up into a number of different principalities because a number of different invaders speaking different languages and having different agendas and so on inhabited different parts of Europe. The quality of life, for various reasons, plummeted from its high water mark, say about 170 to about 300 in the Roman Empire, when life was good, peaceful, prosperous, and so on. So with the onset of these barbarian invasions in the early Middle Ages, what we now call the Dark Ages, life was difficult. People primarily trying hard to keep body and soul together. And what that meant is that a lot of people had much less time for education, much less time to devote to cultivating the mind, because they were living a much more physical existence, simply trying to stay alive. And so, as I say, life grew much harder during the Dark Ages. And it's not until a good deal later, to almost 1,000 years later, that you have, because of the Crusades and Crusaders bringing back from the markets of Western Asia, bringing back into Europe exotic goods like spices and silks and precious gems and that kind of thing, that you began to have a thirst for these products developed in Western Europe, and so you began to have a trade primarily by Italians. You can see the geography of Europe. In the geography of Europe, Italy is very well suited for trade between East and West and between North and South. Trade developed, and so these Italian merchants began to get rather wealthy. As the old saying is, time is money, and so as these Italian merchants grew wealthier, they could afford servants to take care of the basic physical functions of life, and so they had more time on their hands for leisure and study. And it's at this point that one of the great coincidences in all of intellectual history occurs. While they have time on their hands and begin to, by the way, the ancient Greek word for time, leisure time, is skole. While they decided they wanted to turn that leisure time to scholastic activities and begin to learn, they could learn Latin relatively easily because the Catholic Church was conducted in Latin. But behind ancient Roman culture, as I mentioned a few moments ago, lay ancient Greek culture. And the ancient Greek language had died out in the early Middle Ages, and there was no one in Europe that could speak Greek. And indeed, for that reason, there were no ancient Greek books lying around. So it's at this point that one of the great coincidences in all of human history occurred. At just the time when some of these Italian merchants were beginning to want to desire to learn Greek, to get at their roots of the civilization. And mind you, by the way, it's all they had in those days. They didn't have as subjects for study computer science. They didn't have aerospace engineering and cell biology, right? So your basic topics of study are going to be things like history and literature, philosophy and religion. And so, you can exhaust the Latin, you can exhaust those subjects in Latin relatively quickly, but then if you want to go further than that, what lies behind that is the ancient Greek sources, and this they had no access to. And so it's at just this point that in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which had managed to remain an empire, they are beginning to be invaded by the Muslims. And so Muslim refugees begin to turn up in Italy at just this time. The eastern half of the Roman Empire was Greek-speaking, and some of these refugees would have been monks carrying with them manuscripts of ancient Greek classical texts, and so they bring them into the West, and crucially, they bring the ability to decipher these texts, to read the language. And so, since that's essentially their only marketable skill, they begin to teach the knowledge of the ancient Greek language in Italian schools, and so you begin to have the rebirth then of a knowledge of ancient Greek. And as this first generation of scholars begins to read ancient Greek classical texts, they begin to notice everywhere they look in these ancient texts this fundamental, this underlying assumption that human beings are equal. Now, mind you, this Renaissance, this rebirth of the language of ancient Greece, is taking place not in the Renaissance, it's taking place in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, as you all know, is a period of great authority. That is to say, people who lived in the Middle Ages lived their lives by looking toward authority. This is true politically. The Middle Ages, the landscape of Europe is dominated by kings, noblemen, dukes, that is, individual people who are making their own decisions that affect large groups of other people. It was a period of authority in religion. The only religion in Europe at the time was the Catholic Church, which is a very hierarchical, authoritarian institution dominated by a single man, the Pope, and a group of men, the bishops, who then set the doctrine for the church. It's not a democratic institution, as, for instance, maybe the local Baptist church is. If you don't like your local Baptist preacher, you can all get together and vote him out. It's not the way things work in the Catholic Church. It's very hierarchical. And then also philosophically, it was not a matter of ancient Greek philosophy where different equal minds argue with one another. What you had more was a reliance, again, on authority. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest philosopher of the Middle Ages, if he wants to prove a point, as long as he can argue you back to a statement in Scripture, and as long as he can argue you back to a statement that is where a great and well-respected philosopher has said it, then he has proved his point by appealing to authority. And it's in that context that you have the Renaissance, the rebirth of the knowledge of ancient Greek language, and therefore the rebirth of this ancient Greek idea that human beings are basically equal. That was an enormous intellectual explosion in the history of the West. And so that, in turn, then leads to a number of consequences. One is it is the beginning of the democratic revolutions. These are slow, and since we're talking about power, and people do not like to give up power, and people who have no power sometimes take a while to get used to the idea that they ought to have power. This was a slow development that happened over time, but it does, beginning in the Renaissance, and over time, more and more democracies, more and more kingdoms transformed into republics, and then eventually democracies in Europe. And a perfect example of this, by the way, is if you take out your copy of the Declaration of Independence and read it again, it's a crucial document to know, and it tells this story, right, that the colonies were originally part of the kingdom. The king is usurping usurping too much power, and using it to the detriment of the colonists. The colonists have the God-given right to be free, and since all men are equal and free, therefore they have the right to overthrow the king. And then finally, in matters of religion as well, it's very true that the Protestant Reformation, the idea that Martin Luther can say, no longer do I accept church authority and the authoritative teachings of the church. My view of salvation doesn't square with the church's view of salvation, and I have to go with what I think because my mind is equal to theirs. That occurs in the aftermath of the Renaissance and touches all, and again, as you can see, a complete transformation of the religious landscape of Western Europe as well. And so the Renaissance then has profound implications, perhaps none more profound than in science and technology. I mean, just look at the cell phones. When I was a kid, there was no such thing as a cell phone. Then came the gigantic, bulky satellite phones, almost as big as a telephone book. You young folks don't even know what a telephone book is, I suppose. And then phones get better and smaller. They get better and smaller every, 2 or 3 years because somebody else whose ideas are just as good as the previous engineers comes along and decides that we can do it better this way, and so on. And so that's not relying on authority, not saying simply because my authority, my engineering professor at the university said it must be this way, therefore it must be this way. No, I've got a better idea. Perhaps my idea about the design of a cell phone is better, and so on. And this is true in all areas of medical technology, all areas of science and other forms of technology. And that is a direct result of this belief, this reawakened belief in equality that begins with the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance comes to Italy in the very late 1300s, early 1400s, but remember, we're still in a medieval world in the rest of Europe, and since communication is slow and difficult at this time, it takes time for the Renaissance to come to spread slowly to other places in Europe. It doesn't come to England until it's in the very late, maybe 1498, that a couple of English scholars at Oxford learned that you can learn Greek, that is the language of the New Testament. These were theologians at Oxford, and so why wouldn't they want to travel to Italy, where Greek was being taught, in order to read the New Testament in the original language? So they traveled to Italy. Grocyn and Colet are their names. Travel to Italy, learn Greek, and then bring it back to Oxford, and slowly over decades, other Englishmen begin to learn the language. So I think we can say that by about 1520, 1530, you have the Renaissance beginning to come to England, and I would say the high water mark about the middle of Shakespeare's career, about 1600. So what we're dealing with in the 17th century, and we'll date the 17th century starting in 1603. That's the death of Queen Elizabeth and the accession to the English throne of James I, who had been King of Scotland, now becomes James I of England. From 1603 until 1660, that's what we'll call, for our purposes, the Renaissance. That's the second half of the Renaissance in England. These ideas about the equality of the human mind are being absorbed, right? They had been learned in the 1500s, in the 16th century. Now in the 17th century, I think we can say they are beginning to be absorbed, and these ideas are beginning to be worked out. A couple of corollaries of that in terms of some of the big themes we're going to be looking at this summer in the class. First of all, if our minds are equal, and if we therefore should question what authority says, therefore we can question everything. And it's the beginnings of the 17th century that we begin to see the rise of atheism in Europe. Not spoken about much openly, because Europe is still an overwhelmingly Christian society, but the occasional philosopher now and then beginning to question the existence of God. If we can question everything, then we can question even the existence of God. So you have a great concern on the part of many writers to push back against this, and you have a great emphasis, not just because it had an enormous cultural importance, Christianity did, that pervaded the daily life, can we say the hourly life of most people in Europe at the time, but also with beginning to question the relevance, the truth of Christianity. You also begin to have some pushback on that. And so we're going to be seeing over the course of the 17th century a fair amount of writing that is explicitly religious in nature. And we'll begin to see that primarily with John Donne. Another theme that we're going to be following over the course of the semester, and that is the which we say a mode of writing called classicism. The word classical is a Latin word which has to do, which in some ways means the best. And classical is a term that came to be used to refer to ancient Greek and ancient Roman civilization, a high degree of civilization, at least in Roman times and the times of the mid-empire, a period of peace and security and prosperity, so very good, the best times for those reasons as well. And so the classical world refers to ancient Greece and Rome. And so you have a revival of interest there was always interest in Rome, but a revival of interest in ancient Greece. And so you begin to have writers during this period. And the first one of these we're going to look at is going to be the subject of our next video, and that is Ben Jonson, who is writing consciously in the classical tradition of the ancient Roman, and to some extent ancient Greek poets. And we're going to see a great deal of classical influence in Ben Jonson's style. And then there's going to be a reaction to that as well a bit later in the semester. So these are two, and then I should say as well that the questioning of authority in political matters works its way out in the 17th century as well. I just mentioned in 1603 the accession to the throne of James I of England. He's succeeded by Charles I. Charles I inherits not only the throne, but he inherits a situation of increasing difficulty, where English society becomes increasingly divided between two main camps. On the one hand, you have the older, more traditional elements of society who are, in terms of religion, more conservative and tend more to the traditional and Catholic end of the spectrum. In politics, they are traditionally in favor of the king. In terms of geography, they tend to be located in the countryside. They tend to be rural, and their wealth tends to be in terms of the old forms of wealth, land and livestock and so on. On the other hand is a rising middle class, centered primarily in the city of London. Their wealth tends to be primarily in terms of trade and cash, which is beginning to circulate more freely in the 17th century. And these people also tend to be, in religious terms, more Protestant. So in the Church of England, the only official established church, they're on the more Protestant end of things. You also have the Presbyterian Church, primarily in Scotland, but also to some extent in England, and things like groups like the Anabaptists and so on. These, as I say, tend to favor the new wealth, and in terms of politics, they tend to favor the Parliament, particularly the House of Commons. And these two divisions in society, the Royalists, Catholics, and the old landed wealth, as opposed to the more democratic, more Protestant, more tradesman type of folks, these are growing farther and farther apart, the division becoming sharper and sharper and more acrimonious, until in the 1640s England erupts into civil war. By the way, that civil war is eventually over pretty much by 1647, when they captured King Charles I. 1649, they cut off his head, and then for a period of 10 years, from roughly the 1650s, England was without a king, an interregnum. The promised democracy, the promised great republic, never materialized, as so often is the case after these revolutions that are undertaken in the name of the people. And in fact, England became a kind of one-man military rule by Oliver Cromwell, the chief parliamentary general during the Civil Wars, and he ruled England personally until 1659, when he died. And at that point, the English were so sick of that rule that they begged Charles II, who had fled during the Civil Wars, had gone to France, to come back and ascend the throne. So in 1660, the new king ascends the throne, and that really culturally marks such a shift in terms of literary culture, in terms of painting, in terms of politics. In so many ways, it marks such a shift and such a departure from what goes on in the earlier 17th century that we really will end our story in the 1650s. The 1660s really opens a new era of at least English intellectual history called the Restoration. That's what we call 1660 when Charles II was restored to the throne. Restoration and early 18th century tends to be a different, has a very different feel, and so that would be a different course. It's beyond the scope of this course. So those are some of the themes that we're going to be looking at in general in this course, and in many ways they are all organic developments of what we call the Renaissance. The Renaissance meaning two things. Very narrowly then, it's the rebirth of the knowledge of ancient Greek, and that led then more broadly to this general idea that in reaction to what had dominated the thinking of the Middle Ages, this idea that generally speaking, human beings are equal and anybody can have the next big idea. And that's why with the coming of the Renaissance, you see such an explosion of different kinds of techniques in music, in painting, in architecture, in literature, and so on. So that's what the Renaissance is, we can say. And the 17th century is the sort of second half of the Renaissance in England, and we're going to see those Renaissance ideas working themselves out in fascinating ways over the course of this semester.